Welcome back to Unapologetically Visible, the podcast for high achieving Latina and women of color founders who are done being the best kept secret. I'm your host, Christina Olivarez, award winning visibility and leadership coach, TEDx speaker, and founder and CEO of the Social Butterfly Gal and Hustle and Socialize. I have always been the only. Well, for starters, I am an only child, and I spent the majority of my entrepreneurial career in rooms where I was the only one. I was the only Latina in the room. I was the only person from the South Texas border in the room. I was the only youngest person in the room, the one whose name would get mispronounced right before she walked onto stage. By the way, it's Olivarez, Olivarez, which isn't my original last name. My maiden name is Ochoa, but I would often walk into these rooms trying to figure out if I even belonged in those rooms. I remember going to the north side of San Antonio for one event, and I was showing up to this event, and the cars in the valet were all Lexuses and Ferraris, and I'm over here coming into the valet with a 2007 Ford Fusion, blasting Daddy Yankee as loud as I could, which is true to who I am. You know, I was bold, I was bright, and I was too much. And you know what? I was totally fine with being too much. That's really what Christina is all about. And during the early days in business, I tried to not take up too much space because I was afraid that if I showed my full self, if I showed up as the quirky girl or just somebody who was super bold and bright and bubbly, that people would not take me serious as an entrepreneur, especially because I was so young when I first started. I was fresh out of college. So throughout the journey of my entrepreneurship, I would often soften my tone. I would dress the part. Obviously, my brand is pink. And for the early days, I was wearing pink all the time. And then there's a sudden shift that you will see where I started to wear a lot more black tones and really tried my best to not be like the girl that was wearing pink. I would often over prepare, over perform, and over explain just to make everybody feel comfortable with my presence. And that's what being the only does to you. That's what the fear of taking up space and being your full, unapologetic self will do to you as well. It's that fear of being too much, being too annoying, being too bitchy. It teaches you to shrink your edges so no one mistakes your confidence for arrogance or your conviction for attitude or even your cultural pride as a threat. It teaches you that visibility must come with an apology. And that's one of the reasons why this podcast is named Unapologetically Visible. Because as Latinas, we are not here to apologize for taking up space just because it makes you feel uncomfortable. So in this episode, we are diving into how I unlearned that taking up space is arrogant and how to stop saying sorry for being seen. We are going to talk about what it actually means to take up space online and offline as a Latina founder, as a woman of color, a wife, a mom, a leader, because taking up space isn't just about volume. It's about ownership. And for women of color, that ownership is political. And that ownership is a true revolutionary act. When I think back to my early 20s, walking into marketing meetings with my clients as the youngest social media strategist in the room, I remember feeling like my ideas had to sound twice as logical before they would be taken seriously. I remember always making sure that I had my data and my metrics to back up why they needed to increase my pay on my contract with specific clients, and also why social media was a really great avenue and a way to market their business online. I will never forget one time an older white gentleman made me feel like my strategies were stupid because I didn't have a master's degree in communications just like he did. May I remind you that his master's degree in communications was from 1988. And we were already in 2019, 2020, where we were dealing with the rise of social media marketing and especially utilizing more video content. And none of social media, no TikTok, no Instagram, no Facebook, none of that existed in the marketing field at the time that he got his master's. But I digress. I would speak out loud all the things that I knew to be true about my strategies that were tried and tested and true. And I would watch men in the room repeat my exact words 10 minutes later, and suddenly the whole table nodded that it was a great idea. And instead of calling it out, I would always tell myself, Christina, just be grateful that you are even in these rooms, that you are even at this table, because I fought so hard to actually get into that room. And I also paid my dues. That's a common saying in the workforce, especially somebody who's young and fresh out of college that needs to gain that experience. We're often told you need to get experience, but before you do, you need to pay your dues. And that's doing so much of the grunt work in order to truly be taken seriously. That's the lie that so many of us internalize, that gratitude is obedience. You should always be humble and grateful that you even have the opportunity to be in the room, that you even have the opportunity to be considered. And that's the exact reason why, let me remind you, if you own your own company, you are your own boss. But for many people, that's always why they felt like they shouldn't rock the boat, because they are humble and gracious enough to actually have access to the proximity of those people in those rooms. So why even would you even consider rocking the boat or saying something or taking up space? That is how we always do things, is the worst mindset that anybody could ever have. And it took me years to realize that humility and silence are not the same thing. Humility is knowing your power and choosing when to use it, while silence comes from fear. It's just suppression dressed up as strategy. Growing up, I watched a lot of women in my family and family friends navigate spaces that were never built for them in mine. They were brilliant, funny, loud, capable, but they were constantly told to quiet down. And I know for so many Latinas, this is a common thing that we hear culturally and generationally. I was a very quirky and bold, loud girl growing up. I was never afraid to own the spotlight. I always loved singing and dancing and performing. And I knew at a young age I was meant for big things. I would often dream of leaving the Rio Grande Valley and going to New York to become that television reporter on Good Morning America. That was my dream. But sometimes I would have family members try to silence that dream of me going big and being on TV, like living in LA or New York City, because they would try to get me to remember that those big dreams don't happen to girls like me from the Valley. So when I entered into entrepreneurship, that conditioning followed me. I learned very quickly to perform confidence instead of actually embody it, to curate my persona instead of actually claiming who I am, to shrink just enough, not fully, but to shrink just enough to still be likable so that I could be approachable and that people could hire me and want to work with me. There was this one event in 2017 that changed everything for me. I was invited to a corporate luncheon where there were many executive women, all older than me, and also non-Latina and non-women of color. I was excited to be invited into the room, but when I got there, I felt it. It was this familiar energy of skepticism. That invisible question floating around in the room, what is she doing here? And then I started to get frustrated because as I was looking around the room, as I was in these luxurious spaces with people who did not look like me, I realized I am the only Latina in the room. Oh, and also, I'm the only 20-something in the room. And I was like, what the hell? I live in San Antonio, Texas. How could this be? Where are the Latinas? Where are these businesswomen? Like, why is this the case? And my first instinct was to shrink, to make myself palatable. And then I remembered, no, you are here, be seen just as you are. So I participated in the corporate lunch. I said hi to people. I introduced myself. And then I got on my soapbox on Facebook. And I still have it to this day, which I love because that's kind of the basis and the premise of how Hustle and Socialize got started. But I got on my soapbox on Facebook and I wrote this huge ass post talking about being the only Latina in that room and how I was just dumbfounded that this was a thing. But the responses weren't the kind that I actually expected. All of the responses were confirmation that this was the norm. And that even pissed me off even more because I was like, how is this the norm? And how are you guys even accepting this as the norm? And I knew from that moment that instead of actually bitching and complaining about this online, I needed to radically take up space and start unapologetically being visible and pivot my messaging away from just that social media strategist, social butterfly gal, to really thinking about how I want to live out my legacy and the purpose behind my mission and vision, which is focusing on Latinas and women of color founders. Then a couple of weeks after that, I got invited to speak on a panel. And halfway through that panel, I found myself starting to shift the conversation, talking about visibility, culture, and why representation and leadership matter. And you could feel the air shift. And I was getting so jazzed. I mean, I felt it in my body and my way of being. And I feel like every time that I get on stage and I talk about all of the things about representation and being a Latina in business, you see the fire in me. You see that energy. You know, and I know that this is my exact purpose about reimagining what it means to be a highly visible leader as a Latina and a woman of color leader. And at that point in that panel, I saw the audience really start to lean in. Not because I impressed them with my strategies and all of the accolades that I've had in social media management and in consulting and now in coaching, but because I owned my story without apology. And that day I walked out realizing taking up space doesn't require anyone's permission. It requires your full unapologetic presence. And the only permission you need is your damn self. Your presence is someone that no one can give you. You have to claim it. So let's talk about what this actually looks like, especially for those of us navigating visibility as Latinas and women of color in business right now in the current political and social climate that is 2025, almost going into 2026. Well, we are currently living in a moment where taking up space for Latina and women of color founders is super crucial. Our communities are being under attack, and the more times that we are actually taking up space, the more it becomes a revolutionary act. For many women who are in business, the mere thought of visibility or the thought of taking up space scares us because for so long, we as Latinas were often told not to take up space. And so when we think about having to be on camera or pitching ourselves, raising our prices or stepping up on stage and really living out our full authentic self, it shows up in so many ways of fear because of our collective trauma that we have around what it truly means to actually take up space as a marginalized community. Taking up space means saying your name with full authority, even when others stumble on it. It means showing up online without diluting your message just to fit the algorithm's approved language. It means anchoring your brand in your values, even when those values are political. Because we need to be really real. Business is political. Every time we decide who gets access, who we hire, whose stories that we platform, and whose voices we actually pay, it's political. Being a woman in business is political. There are specific policies from a local level to the federal ones that do affect how we run our businesses, especially as a woman of color. the way we are taxed as small business owners, the way we receive our health care, our child care, reproductive care in general, the way we actually build our business and have access to capital. All of these things do require for us as Latinas and women of color founders to take up space, to actually speak out loud, and to be in a position where we can advocate for ourselves and for others, other as a Latina in business and as a woman of color. Because being a woman of color with power is revolutionary. So when you say that your brand is apolitical, what you're really saying is, I'm protecting comfort over change. And I get it. Comfort feels safe, and right now, we do need to be safe. But transformation doesn't happen in safety. It happens in speaking out and living out in your truth. Taking up space means you stop asking, who am I to say this? And instead start asking, who am I not to say this? It's the shift from performative leadership to embodied leadership, from doing what looks right to what feels right. And speaking of, I have an episode about performative leadership versus embodied leadership and what it has taught me, which you can find in the show notes below. Check out episode 14. But let's be real. Everything comes with a cost. And for so many of the clients that I serve, they think that the cost is more about what taking up space will do and what speaking up will actually cost them. But that's not the most effective way of thinking. Let's be honest about what it costs you when you don't take up space. When you minimize your brilliance to keep the peace, you pay for it in resentment. You see other people who are not women of color get the opportunities that you wish that you had, and it's because they were the ones that were actually taking up space. They were the ones showing off their expertise, and let's be honest, they are not really as special as you are. When you silence your values to protect your brand, you're paying for it in energetic leakage. When you try to appeal to everybody, you are not standing for anything. And that is the number one truth that I've had to learn, because for the longest time, I was so afraid about speaking out on specific policies that were not only affecting me, but also my community. And I really had to understand how to stand up for the things that I truly believe in, because that is what's super important to me. But there are also the values that I live out in my brand and in my daily life, and in the work that I do to uplift those communities. When you shrink to be relatable, you pay for it in authority and trust. I always love sharing contrarian ways of thinking or prioritizing my perspective and my lived experience and my expertise in my own content and in my own brand, because I don't want to be like every other coach out there. I'm not every other coach out there. I am an expert in my true way of the expertise, and that's why it's so important for me to take up space and for you to do so as well. And that's what I see with so many of my clients. The high-achieving Latina founders running six-figure businesses, respected in their industries, but quietly questioning everything that they do online. They have traction, clients, and the visibility, but sometimes something always tends to feel off. They've built the brands that fit everyone else's comfort level, but it no longer fits who they are becoming. And that's what taking up space is all about. It's about recalibration. It's about catching yourself in these micro moments when you start editing your truth before you even speak it. It's about remembering that you are not responsible for other people's comfort. You are responsible for your own alignment. Even now, after a decade in this work, I still catch myself sometimes shrinking. Sometimes it's before a big keynote where I know I'm going to say something and it might piss people off, and I have to get really comfortable with being uncomfortable about that. Sometimes I find myself shrinking when I am about to post something super bold. And again, it could piss people off, or it could turn people off and they could unfollow me or unsubscribe. And you know what? That is okay, because the more people unfollow me and the more people unsubscribe, the more it opens up for people who are actually aligned with my mission, my vision, my values, and who truly actually want to be here. Sometimes I find myself shrinking before I make the decision to raise my prices or to say that it does cost X amount to work with me one-on-one. The pattern whispers, "Don't rock the boat, Christina. Be grateful." And I have to pause and coach myself through it. Here's what this sounds like for me as I do some self-coaching Anytime I feel like I am shrinking and not taking up enough space. Whose comfort am I actually protecting right now? What am I afraid will happen if I take up my full unapologetic space? Is this decision coming from fear or is it coming from faith? Those three questions pull me back into my body and into my power. They remind me that taking up space is not an act of defiance. It's an act of devotion. Devotion to the women who have come before me and the ones who are watching me right now. It is devotion to that little girl from Mission, Texas, who needed to see someone like me on that stage. Let's bring this to the digital space because I know so many of you listening are navigating that exact tension on how to show up fully online without feeling like you're too much. Taking up space online does not mean constant posting or endless vulnerability. It means congruent. It means your energy, your story, and your offers are all aligned. It means you don't have to shrink your prices to be accessible. You don't have to water down your message to be neutral. And you don't have to silence your cultural identity to be professional. That's a huge one. And I love that so many of the Latinas that I'm meeting currently are not shrinking themselves to look and act professional. They're wearing their hoops. They're wearing their hair curly. They are dressing up in full boldness. And that makes me so excited and so happy because taking up space, whether it is in person or online, means that specifically for online, your content sounds like your truth. Means you let your audience witness your evolution in real time. All of the doubts, the breakthroughs, the boundaries, the transparency that actually builds relational trust. And if you are building a proximity-based business like mine, that trust is your currency because clients don't invest only on what you know. They invest in who you are. Let's do some strategic coaching right now. If you're listening and if you are able to, please grab a notebook or you could open your notes app on your phone. You could always come back to this as well. But we're going to audit where you're currently shrinking and how to reclaim that space. So step number one, we want to identify the room. What is the room where you feel like you're the only one? Maybe it's in your client container, in a networking space, in a boardroom, on your Instagram feed, your family table, your family dinner table. I want you to identify that room and write it down. Step number two, we're going to name the behavior. What do you do in that room to make yourself smaller? Do you stay quiet when you have something to say? Do you code switch? Do you soften your language? Do you downplay your success? And now step number three, we're going to trace the fear. What are you protecting by doing that? Is it acceptance or validation, safety? I want you to get brutally honest. What's the story you're still believing about what happens when you are fully seen and fully unapologetically you? Step number four, we're going to redefine safety because real safety isn't silence. It is self-trust. So I want you to ask yourself, what would it look like to create safety from within instead of waiting for the room to actually give it to you? Maybe that's creating a morning ritual or a prayer, maybe having a mentor or a community that mirrors that value back to you. And step number five, I want you to take micro action. Visibility doesn't require a big revolution. It starts with a micro action of courage. So choose one thing this week that's going to honor your voice. Speak up in that meeting, post that caption that's been sitting in the drafts, share your price without flinching, say your full name, and let the silence hold. That's how you train your nervous system to normalize your own power, one micro moment at a time. Taking up space isn't just about personal empowerment. It's about collective liberation. Every time a woman of color owns her story, she widens the doorway for someone else to do the same. And every time you say, I belong here, you rewrite the narrative for your entire community and your entire lineage. And that is what Unapologetically Visible has always been about. We are the generation that gets to define what Latina wealth, leadership, and power look like. It doesn't have to be polite. And it obviously doesn't have to be performative, but it's got to be rooted and embodied. So if you're waiting for someone else to tell you that it's okay to take up more space, maybe this is your sign. Although I don't need to give you permission, you just got to own it. I want you to know that it's okay to be loud about your brilliance. It's totally okay to hold the dualities of ambition and softness and strength. It's okay to disrupt the rooms that were never designed for you. I always love to say that I always love making people feel uncomfortable. I always love making people squirm a bit because that's what it is. I'm a disruptor and I come here to disrupt things because I want you to remember that your presence is not a threat. It's a recalibration. If you resonated with this episode, here's what I want you to do next. Subscribe and leave a review because that helps this podcast reach more women like us, women who were never meant to stay hidden, women who are meant to be highly visible leaders. I want you to share this episode with someone you love who is a little bit nervous about taking up space. And DM me on Instagram at the Social Butterfly Gal. Tell me your biggest reframe or your biggest breakthrough from today's conversation. And if you're feeling the call to go deeper, to recalibrate your personal brand, leadership, and your visibility, I would love to support you through one-on-one coaching. You can find the coaching information and the offers and the links in the show notes below, or you could send me a DM on Instagram with the word coaching, and I will personally walk you through what offers are in alignment with your current season and what it looks like to step into this next era with clarity, confidence, and unapologetic authority. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening and for all of the shares and reviews. Remember this, you didn't come this far to play safe. You came here to be unapologetically visible. I'll see you next week.